Tritone Substitution. What are they and how do we use them? Well, first I want to say that the Tritone Substitution is one of the most common chord substitutions in jazz. But the Tritone Substitution can of course be found in other kind of music genres. Now, a Tritone Substitution is when a dominant seventh chord is substituted for another dominant seventh chord, a tritone away from the original chord. For example, here's G7, and the dominant seventh chord, a tritone away, is D flat 7. So we can substitute the G7 chord for D flat 7. G7, D flat 7. If that sounds complicated, don't you worry. Now, in order to really understand what the tritone substitution is, we need to have a basic understanding of what the dominant seventh chord is and what the tritone is. A dominant seventh chord is a chord which consists of 4 different notes. A root, G for example, a major third, B in this case, a perfect fifth, D, and a minor seventh, F. Here's a G dominant seventh chord, G7. Now, what's a tritone? A tritone is an interval that some people may know as the devil's interval. The distance between the 2 notes of the tritone is 6 semitones. For example, here's F, and if we want to play another note, a tritone away, we count to 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The 6th note is B. So the notes F and B is a tritone. Okay, back to the dominant seventh chord, which I talked about in the beginning. Now I want you to notice that in our dominant seventh chord, for example, G7, we actually have a tritone. The G7 chord consists of G, B, D, and F. We know that F and B are actually a tritone away from each other. B is the major third, and F is the minor seventh of G. And those 2 notes are a tritone away from each other. This is very important to notice and remember. Yes, you may say now, this is all good, but get to the point. What's a tritone substitution and how do we use them? I'll explain this very soon. So now we know that the dominant seventh chord consists of a tritone, and it is this interval which kind of makes the dominant seventh chord a little bit unstable, and it adds tension to the chord. That's why we usually resolve a dominant seventh chord to a tonic chord. The tonic chord, the 1 chord, can be found a perfect fifth below the dominant seventh chord or a perfect fourth above the dominant seventh chord. Here's G, and a perfect fourth above we have a C, the tonic. If we're playing a G7 chord and we want to resolve it, we usually resolve it to some kind of C major or C minor chord. For example, like this. Or like this. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the tritone that we have in the G7 chord, B and F, which is the major third and the minor seventh of G. Those 2 notes, I would argue, are the 2 most important notes of the G7 chord. So if we want to, we can just play those 2 notes in combination with the root. Here's B and F, the tritone, with the root, G. This is still a G7 chord. This chord can be resolved to a C major 7 chord. For example, I'm also playing the C major 7 chord with only 3 notes here, just to make things easier and simpler. Now let's make the progression a little bit more interesting. Let's add a D minor 7 chord. Here's a D minor 7 chord with only 3 notes. We have the root D, we have the minor 3rd F, and we have the minor 7th C. So now we have the following progression: D minor 7, G7, and C major 7. This progression is called a major 2-5-1 in the key of C, probably one of the most common chord progressions in music. Now let's substitute the G7 chord for the tritone substitution. What's the tritone away from G7? Let's go up 6 semitones from G. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so the tritone from G is D flat. So instead of playing a G note, we're gonna play D flat instead. But we will keep the B and the F from the G7 chord. So instead of playing G, F, and B, we will now play D flat, F, and B. What kind of chord is this? It's another dominant 7th chord, it's D flat 7. This is the tritone substitution for G7. Now this is really cool. Listen to this. This is important. What was the original minor 7th of G has now become the major 3rd of D flat. And the minor 3rd of G has now become the minor 7th of D flat. Let's listen to this progression now. We have D minor 7, D flat 7, and C major 7. Sounds great, doesn't it? Why not use both the G7 chord and the D flat 7 chord? Listen to this. Okay, here's a recap of what we have talked about this far. When we substitute the G7 chord for a D flat 7 chord, we're using the tritone substitution. We have kept the 2 most important notes from the G7 chord, the B and the F, which is a tritone apart from each other. This interval adds a lot of tension to the music, and we resolve this interval to the tonic chord, C major 7. So we kept the most interesting interval and sound from the G7 chord, but we replaced the root with its tritone, which is D flat. So instead of playing G7, we play D flat 7. So when can you use the tritone substitution? Generally, we use tritone substitutions when we want to resolve a dominant 7th chord to a tonic chord, the 1 chord. If we, for example, play a 2-5-1-6 progression, which is D minor 7, G7, C major 7, and A7, we can substitute the G7 for D flat 7. We already know this, but we can also substitute the A7 chord for E flat 7, because the D minor 7 chord is a perfect 4th above the A7 chord. You could say that the D minor 7 chord is a tonic chord in relation to A7. So instead of playing D minor 7, G7, C major 7, and A7, we can play D minor 7, G7, D flat 7, C major 7, A7, and then E flat 7. It sounds something like this. One last thing before I end this lesson. Why do we use tritone substitutions? There are several reasons, and some of them are because we want to add variation to our chord progressions. And if we want a smooth transition from the dominant 7th chord to the tonic chord, we can use tritone substitutions, since the root of the dominant 7th chord will move down a half step to the tonic. And if we want to play different scales and arpeggios on the dominant 7th chord, the tritone substitution is a great choice. I don't have time to talk about the scale in detail, which we use on tritone substitutions, but the scale is the Lydian dominant. So when we have the progression D minor 7, D flat 7 and C major 7, you can play the Lydian dominant scale on the D flat 7 chord. This scale is the 4th mode of the A-flat melodic minor scale, which contains the same notes as the G altered scale. Okay, that's it. What's your thoughts about this lesson and tritone substitutions? Let me know in the comment section down below. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you learned something new. If you want to learn more about guitar playing and if you want me to keep posting lessons, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Before I go, a special shout out to all my supporters on my Patreon page. Okay, that's it for now. Thank you for watching and I'll see you next time. Cheers!